Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus.
Last week on the campus of Utah Tech University, the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit took place. And in this summit, or at this summit, several speakers agreed to talk to us about what they had going on in the field of linking together humanities and technology. This conference was eye-opening in a lot of ways, and it was very interesting to hear what different people had to say.
I thought it was really exciting to see how the humanities are really processing a lot of technological change in the future, and especially, as our favorite topic of AI writing comes up quite a bit. But it was exciting to see what people are doing right now.
Yeah, it was. It was a very positive and thought-provoking conference, and we would like to share with you several presenters who took the time to speak with us in our mobile podcast setup that we had at the conference. For this portion of the podcast, we have a couple of segments that we recorded during the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit at Utah Tech. This was the first summit of its kind, the first conference of its kind here at Utah Tech, and some of the top scholars and entrepreneurs and students from around the country and even around the world have come to present on topics of Polytechnic concern. Much of the theme of this conference, and certainly the theme of this segment, is going to be the integration of a Polytechnic vision and technology with the humanities, with disciplines that traditionally are thought of as being outside of the STEM or even the STEAM field, humanities. I have with me today Dr. John Wolfe and one of his students, William Holsworth, who's done a project in Dr. Wolfe's class in which he does some interdisciplinary research in which they work together to integrate these very kinds of things that we've been talking about. So John, why don't you introduce the project, and then we'll hear from William about how that project actually went.
Good. Sounds good. Well, thank you for having me. First off, thank you for letting us be here today and have a conversation. This is really exciting work. As I've said on several occasions, William produced one of the most impressive projects that I've encountered in my 16 years of teaching. And anytime we can talk about the work that he or my other students are doing, I'm more than happy to do so. William is, from the moment I encountered him when he came into my office to talk about possibly attending UT, he has been an individual who has been really interested in the intersections between multiple disciplines. He's interested in philosophy. He's interested in, is your degree in psychology?
Psychology.
Yes, psychology. And so throughout a lot of his research for me in prior classes and philosophy classes, actually engaged that intersection between philosophy and ethics and psychology. We started working on an independent study project that was beginning as a metaphysics and epistemology readings, and I'll let him talk more about that in a bit. But I sort of, the goal for me was to help William guide him through a process of expanding his thought naturally. And maybe he can speak to how he began to develop his thought, how it started and how it progressed. But what this project in thinking about what is knowledge blossomed into this really fascinating exploration about artificial intelligence, about human advancement, and about how we as humans can think about the process of playing games and what it means to play a game in relation to some of the developments for AI. So I'll let William speak more about his project and how it transitioned between thoughts and grew. And I'll jump in with some comments as he progresses. But I think it's best to hear from the wonderful student's mouth himself. So William.
So the original goal in doing the independent study was to expand my philosophical understanding of disciplines I had not delved into yet, because some of the classes, like on epistemology and metaphysics specifically, were not being offered for that year. So I came to him and we got together, talked about doing such a project. And after getting it all set up, I actually honestly didn't know where I would begin. Just having the knowledge that I just wanted to get into these fields, right? So Dr. Wolfe, suggested some philosophical readings like Plato's Phaedo and Meno. Some other ones, I'm trying to remember, Descartes' Discourse on Method. Yeah. And Hume's Inquiry to Human Understanding.
Now, to just jump in here a little bit, if you're not familiar with those texts, notably Descartes and Hume, they are really sort of early Enlightenment thinkers that are really wrestling with the idea of what constitutes knowledge and how our sensory data and lived experience may not necessarily equate to what we call knowledge. And so Descartes is famous for sort of almost a brain in a jar thought, the cogito, I think, therefore I am. Right. And so he really has this thought experiment about trying to drive down to the idea of what knowledge of the self actually is. And this is sort of brought to its logical conclusion through the work of David Hume, who leads to a far more skeptical, and I say that in a healthy way, skeptical conclusion about how we are individuals and creatures of really what amounts to habit. So the reason why, looking at all the equipment and microphones, the reason why you went through the setup that you did in getting us ready to talk was not because you knew for certain that the technology was going to be functioning properly, but rather because your previous experience had given you an indication that the setup practice would be probable to be successful. And so the sort of space about ambiguity of knowledge was, for me, I think, hopefully for William, a moment of where it began to click and started driving him toward other parts of the project. So where did you go from there, William?
So in that discussion that we were having about Descartes and Hume, the matrix actually came up, because that's Descartes' brain in the jar vat theory come to life in storytelling. And talking about Hume and how he was so skeptical about these experiences that we have, or what knowledge really is, just kind of kickstarted the discussion on artificial intelligence. What would these philosophers think about transferring their theories onto an artificial mind? Can that even be applied? And it just kicked off from there. So from there, we had many discussions theorizing about these subjects. But after that, I actually interviewed Curtis Larson of the Computer Science Division,
a guest on this podcast.
Yes. So we had an hour-long, fascinating discussion on what entails artificial intelligence, what constitutes artificial intelligence, and how it might work, and kind of just throwing around some perspectives on the differences between the human mind and the artificial mind. One of the key findings that I found from that interview, the one that came up, was no matter how advanced we might make artificial intelligence, even future possibilities, the key difference is that we as humans are able to change our prime directive, is what it's called. So artificial intelligence need to be guided by this programming, this force, as you could say, to motivate it to do its task. But when you compare that to us, we are very unpredictable, I guess, in spirit, where we have the ability to just on a dime change our reasoning or motivation to do something, maybe even because you just want to. So that is where my paper really developed. And Wolfe and I talked about that some more, that key finding, and he suggested reading Suits Grasshopper, which is a book about how the process of game playing is actually the ultimate purpose and meaning of life. And
so we should jump in a little bit to say that game playing doesn't mean I'm going to pull out my Nintendo 64 for us old folks and start playing some Mario, but rather it's he's responding to Wittgenstein and some early 20th century game theory, where he argues that there's something within the way that we solve problems that is inherently tied to limiting rules or imposing limitations and trying to achieve a goal within limitations. And so, and that's he calls that the process of playing a game. And so an example would be like work, right? So if we think about what is the purpose or what is the goal for work, well, we want to take care of our family. We want to be able to retire at an appropriate age. We want to have lots of money. We have all these goals associated with work. And the idea is that if we wanted to hypothetically achieve those goals, there's a lot of sort of ways that we would often deem to be unethical or beyond the scope of normal perception that we could achieve those goals. So if money was the only issue, I walk into, there's lots of violent imagery I'm going to say because we know we don't do that, but you can acquire money in ways that most functioning members of society say we're not going to do, right? And so the idea of putting and imposing, in many ways, artificial limitations on our actions for the sake of trying to achieve goals is what Suits calls the process of playing a game. But there is something within the nature of the human experience that says, there's a challenge or benefit, or Hannah Arendt describes this difference between work and labor. There's an enjoyment in the act because of the limitation that I placed on myself in conducting the act, right?
So from there, that's where I brought in the interdisciplinary aspect of my psychology education. So what he was trying to describe what is called the intrinsic motivation, and that's a phenomenon where we just simply do the activity for the activity's sake. So I kind of go into depth on that and bring in extrinsic motivation and the over-justification effect, which is the effect that happens on you when. So let's consider art as an example. You create art for the sake of art, and by having the extrinsic motivation of money or a goal like to achieve for it, an end result, that can actually undermine your intrinsic motivation. And there's a psychological study called the felt-tip marker study. It's I won't get too into it, but essentially they divided children up into 3 groups. One group knew of the reward for drawing with their markers. The second group knew of the reward, but they were told they weren't going to get it. And the third one had no idea there was a reward at all. And what they found was that those who knew of the rewards, even though the one that were told what they weren't going to get it, they found that they had a decreased time in drawing. Those who did not know of the reward drew with their new markers much longer. And that was kind of some evidence that without that external force of a promising result of some kind, without that, we are much happier in doing our activity. So I bring in the concept of work and labor with that too. That's a philosophy of work, but essentially the unifying factors that I brought together were how labor is a never-ending cycle, and work is past that. This is based on Arendt's work, The Human Condition. Work is beyond that to the extent of we're creating something to help ease the labor part of it. But what Arendt calls action is moving past that, past both work and labor, and being able to do an activity for the sake of an activity, intrinsic motivation, but something that might also cause societal influences. Bringing artificial intelligence in that with all the ramifications for ethics, the education system, science, what it might do to our society.
And so one of the things, again, I find fascinating about William's project is that he's drawing a contrast between what AI is, that there has to be this sort of external, using the language that you were describing, there has to be this external motivator, there has to be this external directive, and that is the thing that provides the action for the element. But in the human condition, the human activity, we consider things to be pure, and you can't see quotes on audio, but the things considered to be pure in the intrinsic motivation of the process. And so him drawing this distinction between these two things really helped me as a thinker see have larger conversations about what artificial intelligence is and how eventually what some of the things that his project has allowed me to see is that a lot of the topic or conversation about AI is bound in, misusing language isn't quite the right word, but we're trying to imply language intended originally for human function, human desires, human motivation, and apply it to a thing that is foundationally other or different. And so as a result, we are either going to have to rethink the words that we're using or reinvent new words. And so for somebody who's, focuses on English, how the fluid nature of language, but it was very interesting for me and very helpful for me in some of the larger conversations that I've had this past year about the use of AI at a university, to all of those things because of the project that he was working on, all hinging on this sort of distinction that he made about motivational efforts between human thought and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and we talked about that a little bit yesterday, this idea of the words in the language that are being used, and we questioned a word like generative, right? That, there is now a distinction between, generative technology and other types of technology, but when we talk about generative, many people assume that, something that comes from a human mind, right? When you generate an idea, an original idea, an idea comes from your brain, it comes from your mind, that's its first entrance into the world, that's not what's happening with AI. Some complicated processes are happening, but what we would consider generically, I guess, generically generative, that's not really what's happening. And so that might be an example of one of those words that we need to either find a different word to use or make it clear that when we're using it in connection with AI, we're talking about something different.
Exactly. And, this is the buffalo conversation where you have, if we are using the same word, there runs the risk of misinterpreting or misunderstanding which version of the word that we're using. And so, again, it is an interesting issue of language for me. And again, what I found fascinating about William's project is here we have some foundational disciplines within philosophy. We have epistemology, we have metaphysics, the question, what does it mean to be human? We have some him bringing in elements of his psychology training and background. We have AI all intermingling together in this really fascinating project that again, I know I said it before, is one of the best projects that I've had the opportunity to encounter. So, but yeah, so anything else you want to add about the project?
Yeah, what you both were saying about the language, that's an essential part of epistemology, just the knowledge of what it might mean, how we interpret it, right? And that's something that I covered in my project as well. We had many discussions about this. So we could try to be as careful as we can or create new terms for these concepts. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, something that might be modeled upon the human mind or logic system, it yet can move past that can we even apply the same epistemological framework on these artificial minds? So something that might work for us to describe might not even be relevant at all for this concept. You might be able to explain.
No, yeah. So again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that the language about the framework of brain, neurology, epistemology is grounded in the very distinct human experiences. And we're as you were describing the issue of generative, it is, in philosophy, we have different cases. I mentioned it before in other conversations. The Chinese room, what's traditionally called the Chinese room problem, which is being able to regurgitate and recount necessarily knowledge. And one of the conclusions in the earlier versions of that problem is that just being able to recount doesn't necessarily equate to knowledge. And so what we end up having is this, I keep going back to foundations, this foundational thing of, with all of the concerns about AI, if we're going to talk about it, we are really going to have to think about the language that we're using. And the longer that this goes on, the more I'm pretty convinced that it's insufficient and that we're trying to apply humanistic language to something that is other. And that's dangerous territory no matter how you go. And dangerous maybe isn't quite the right word, but it's problematic territory. It's problematic for understanding what AI is, and it's problematic for understanding what we are. And so having to really rethink the words that we use and the way that we think about it. And not to be too pessimistic, because I'm here with William, I don't know if it's too late for that change to happen or that thought process to happen. But I do think that is something that, as we move forward and this technology continues to advance, again, at the time where this is being recorded, we're within a few weeks, within a few days actually, of talking about how AI is a problem on par or greater than global warming, and they're describing international groups working together akin to nuclear weapons about how to address this. And if the words that we're using to even begin to approach the problem are insufficient, then how in the world can we even begin to try to address the large problem if the symbols that we use don't successfully signify the object? So it's a little pessimistic there, but William's project was really good. So
it's just sort of complex instance of anthropomorphizing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's almost the best way we can explain that divide that's happening there. But yeah, so what he was explaining about like global warming and like all these effects that it might have on science and how it's comparative to those topics. That's something I wanted to bring into my paper too as well. So that brings in the ethics part of it, even bioethics. It's got philosophy of science, philosophy of work. So we're talking about, if I may, I had a conclusion in my paper. This kind of covers what we can do with artificial intelligence, and there's 3 options that we can do. We can regress by either banning it or being super hesitant about it, and just being very restrictive in how we can apply it. That's one way we can go. We can stagnate, and that with that comes hesitancy to really bring it into our society. So we're still kind of, I would say it's about where we're at now. We're trying to decide what to do with artificial intelligence. So we're stagnating. Progress comes with the full immersion of AI into our society, whatever it may come. And that is why humanities is all the more important now. Because with a technological world, something that's going to be so ingrained with our daily lives coming soon, moving forward, we need to really get in touch with what being human really is and how we can explore the the impact that humanity has.
Yeah, and so think about this in terms of our normal advancement, right? So each of us carry a computer in our pockets that sometimes may not be vibrating in the middle of conversations. But we have a computer in our pockets. That technology has vastly changed our world. For those older folks in the room, remember at a time where we had answering machines and we weren't expected to be available at any given time. We had time off. We could, that's not really the case anymore. So there's this integration of technology into our daily lives. But the issue is that when it comes to thinking about these technologies, there is an underlying dangerous, scary underbelly to it. So we can have conversations about lithium and how lithium is harvested and who has access and control of lithium mines. We talk about systemic oppression of people groups because of the means to push this technological development. There is something that is a regular convenience to us that as soon as we're done with this talk, this interview, we're going to check our phones. But that's a phone that has cultural implications, environmental implications, ecological implications, and it is important for us, because it's easy for us to gloss over, but it's important for us to reflect on those impacts. It's important for us to not just blindly push forward with technology and think about the complicated, wicked problem nature that these tools associate with us, because tools, in my mind, tools are inherently dangerous. They're not bad nor good inherently. They just do what they're designed to do. A knife can provide the basis for a wonderful meal, especially with an individual with good knife skills, or it can be used to harm another individual. And so how we ethically, carefully approach these technologies will shape who we are as a society as a whole, as well as who we are individually.
Yeah, and we hope that there will be the same kind of thoughtful approach when it comes to AI. It's not the first, like you say, revolutionary technology, but revolutionary technology almost always brings with it the possibility of tremendous financial gain. And so that becomes something that has to be tempered. And that's not always easy to halt, right? When there's a desire to not just make money, but be the quickest to make money off of something, that's when we start to have to battle a little bit harder to make sure that kind of thoughtful engagement with the new technology, with the new emerging changes in our society becomes so important. And I think that in and of itself really pushes for this idea of having people in the humanities and social sciences, talk about your, work in psychology, all of these people need to be involved in this discussion, not just those who are steeped in the technological aspects of it. Let me ask you this. How did you talked about talking to Professor Larson and seeing what he had to say. How did you like the interdisciplinary experience that you had? How did you like getting out of your major and looking at literature from and talking to people who were experts in other fields?
First off, it was really fascinating to just get so many different perspectives and find a way to unite them all in a way that would be applicable, but also see his weaknesses. Because when you're trying to fit so many disciplines together like a jigsaw puzzle, you see which pieces don't fit and which pieces do. So it's been very... I was telling Dr. Wolfe how in a normal undergrad setting, perhaps even in a graduate setting, it's very rare, almost impossible to get such an extensive experience in crossing over between so many topics and fields. So one of the main things about the academic world today is just so divided. And we're trying to find ways to bring everything together here and there. But interdisciplinary study allows students to do that from the get-go and gain the experience needed to reason on many different levels, evaluate different pairs of lenses to one topic and multiple, depending on what you're doing.
And I think that, students themselves are usually very interested in the idea of complicated problems. And so students, let's pick something purely hypothetical. Let's imagine, I don't know, a basketball team. We'll put them in LA, okay? If we have like a group like the Lakers, there's if them becoming successful is a complicated issue, right? So they have to deal with economics and psychology and physical health and all of those things coming together in order for them to be a successful team, right? And so the things that matter most to students are by their nature interdisciplinary. And I think that as an instructor, trying to show the students what my discipline does, but inherently make it clear that this is not a complete process, that it is necessary by the nature of the problem to bring in psychologists, to bring in computer science individuals, to bring in literature individuals, all of these things that, again, if we're going to have anything from a successful sports team to a successful business, there needs to be multiple experts in the room working together to drive and address these problems. And I think that what I've seen consistently about my students is that they're interested in complicated things, and they are aware that one particular lens is insufficient in addressing those complicated things. And there is a desire for interdisciplinary learning, and there's a desire for interdisciplinary thought, because that is the way that the language that they are seeking for is found. So in one discipline by itself is insufficient and will be insufficient. So.
And that echoes a theme that has been, voiced throughout this conference. And I certainly hope that moving forward, that's also something that Utah Tech University as an institution continues to encourage and, just as importantly, maybe more importantly, support that interdisciplinary study, support the faculty members who design it, but also the students who engage in it and the kind of experience, so that they can have experiences similar to the one that you've had.
Yeah. So one of the key things about such an interdisciplinary project is, or even independent studies in general, is, like I discussed in my project, the intrinsic motivation that comes with it. So you can compare going to class on this specific topic that you might be excited to learn about, right? But it's structured. It's, I don't want to say limiting, but it is, honestly. You have tiers of knowledge that you can get through with a typical class section. But in an interdisciplinary project, you're able to take that advantage of that flexibility and really get into it on your own accord. And that really stems from your own motivation. So I would say it's very hard to imagine a student who wants to do interdisciplinary study and then fails to do it because they have that drive to get started with it anyways.
I think William does bring up a good point that, there's a larger question about the kind of individual who succeeds in this situation. And William is extremely motivated. He's extremely passionate about learning, passionate about thinking about complicated things. And there's a larger question, a larger meta question about how do we work with students to light that fire about learning. And as a philosopher, I can point back to conversations that, as far back as Plato has about how we develop what he calls a sort of philosophic soul, this passion. And actually the language that he uses is eros, which, that carries with it some interesting language implications too. But he says that the love of learning is eros, that it needs to be a passion driving fixated force. And if we're frank, not that sort of quality isn't found in every student that we encounter. And so meta-questioning, how do we drive students to be that kind of independent learner? How do we have them pursue knowledge not for the letter grade, but for their passion and interest in the larger goals that they have? That's a big question, and beyond the scope of the 30 or so minutes that we're talking for right now. But that is a lingering question. That William is right about the motivation, but we're also at an issue where that isn't universally expressed in students. It'd be nice if it could be, but we have to think about a way to drive more students to that self-motivating, love of learning focus as part of their education.
That's a great point. Well, thank you so much for joining me and giving me some of your thoughts about what sounds like a really fascinating project, and I think was a really rewarding project for you. So, like I said, we are at the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit here at Utah Tech, and I've been joined by Dr. John Wolfe and his student, William Holsworth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're back with another installment of a report from the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit here at Utah Tech University. We have two English professors from Utah Tech, Joy McMurrin and Lacy Hope, and they just presented on a couple of projects that they are doing in their classes. And these projects revolve around a big problem that we are facing in the world, and that problem is e-waste. And that problem of e-waste is exacerbated by intentional obsolescence that we see in not just the technological industry, but in many industries. So we'd like to welcome Joy McMurrin back to the program, Lacy Hope to the program for the first time. Tell us a little bit about this problem of e-waste and intentional obsolescence.
So I will tackle planned obsolescence. And then I think Joy really effectively and eloquently talked about e-waste. And so I'd like to have her kind of provide more detail on that. But planned obsolescence is essentially this practice, and we see it especially strong in digital devices where companies will basically make them to make it to where they don't work after a certain number of years. So that's why, you're buying an iPhone every 4 or 5 years, even though the newest version really isn't all that much different than, what was available, a few years back, right?
Can I just ask you a clarifying question there? Is it, I mean, they just won't work, or is there also this idea, how much of it is, I got to get a new phone because it doesn't work, and how much of it is, I got to get a new phone because it's the newest, greatest thing?
Ooh, that's a good question. Honestly, I would say the two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Where, of course, we want the newest, the best. But on that note, it almost kind of seems like these companies are saying, okay, well, we'll give you a reason for it, right? We will, you want the newest and the best. Okay, well, we'll make it to where the camera in your tablet no longer works, or we will make it to where the touchscreen starts to become glitchy after 2 or 3 years, even though, you're buying it for a tablet for $800 or $900. You'll have to reinvest in the years to come. And so, again, perhaps relying on the idea that consumers do want the best, the newest, the fastest, and they're saying, okay, well, we can kind of get away with building things that are not meant to last, and that are meant to become obsolete or outdated. Another good example of this is looking at, how to charge devices. So I know with some of the newer Apple products, you have to have a certain cord versus another. And the cords for the older devices will not work for the newer devices. And so you kind of have to, there's planned obsolescence right there with how you can actually charge and use these, even if the device in and of itself still functions properly. If you can't charge it, then what good is it?
Yeah, and they had, the people in the technological fields had a good model to follow. I don't know much about the history of planned obsolescence, but certainly one of the biggest industries to pioneer that is the automobile industry, right? And that idea of the prestige that comes with a new car certainly has transferred to the prestige of having the newest and latest device.
Absolutely. And what I find especially interesting is, and perhaps we can revisit this later on, is that with iFixit, they actually use the automotive industry as kind of an example for the right to repair. So basically saying that if, let's say, you drive a Toyota, right? You don't have to take it exclusively to a Toyota dealership in order to get a repair done. Like if you have a flat tire or if you need your oil changed, rather, or even if you need to have a completely new engine put in. Rather, you can shop around, you can do that yourself, and the information is essentially available to individuals to carry out this work themselves. So basically saying, if that is the case with the automotive industry, if folks can change their own oil, change a flat tire, or do these major repairs to their vehicles, or shop around outside of the company itself, then why can't we do that with electronics? And many electronic companies today actually have it to where if you open up the device, then the warranty is completely void. And even if you want to try and fix it yourself, take it to someone who is more knowledgeable, whether, that be a neighbor or someone who has a company that does that, then even if the fix can't be done or done effectively, then that company will say, okay, well, you no longer have a warranty because we didn't make the repair ourselves. And of course, when you take it to the company or you send it back in, typically there are a lot of costs associated with that, which make it financially inaccessible and financially exclusive for a lot of folks to repair these devices that oftentimes they put a lot of money into purchasing in the first place.
But Joy McMurrin, this planned obsolescence has some dire consequences for the environment.
It does. I'll talk about e-waste in a second, but I do want to say just one thing about planned obsolescence as a business model, which I said in my presentation I think is obscene. I think we can turn it around. There is some prestige, but also think about the prestige of having beautiful diamonds. And now we're aware of black market diamonds, and we even call them blood diamonds now. The same thing is happening with everything from chocolate, to tortillas in the food world. And there can be some social consequences if we all kind of get on board and we make green cool again, right? And there can be some prestige in retro in having the most outdated device with updated software.
Sure.
And there is a way to create technology that's repairable, that's updatable. And we're allowing policy, we're allowing business practices that are harmful in the face of a climate crisis, I think is inhumane. And we're all just kind of on board with it, myself included. I just shrug my shoulders and say, well, what else can I do? So we recognize there's an e-waste problem too. And especially as writing instructors, the four of us sitting here chatting now are all writing professors. And think of just the writing technologies alone and the ways that our classrooms and the expectations we have for our students to have certain devices and access to the internet and all of these things demand material electronics that come with immaterial consequences. And so Lacy and I recognize the vulnerability and that we're exacerbating environmental and economic and health precarities for particular people around the world, especially those having to deal with the immediate consequences of e-waste. We're all going to have to deal with the long-term consequences, but there are people, especially in the global South, who are suffering immediate consequences of e-waste. It's been called at the global session of the UN Science Policy Business Forum on the environment, the Health and Environmental Justice Support Organization named e-waste as the fastest growing environmental threat. And so we need to address it. So that's what Lacy and I do. We're trying to address it in our classrooms with our technical writing students.
Yeah, I have to say my response this morning when you relayed that information was, I was aware of e-waste, but to be perfectly honest, when I think about the global climate challenges that we're facing, it wasn't top priority in my mind. And when you read that information and presented that information, I just was like, there's an even bigger problem than the one that I've been struggling with, thinking about. So something that has to be done, but something that we can all do something about, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think we can. And the more we all are in the conversation and especially actively doing something about it, the more that projects out to the other people in our circles. And there's a ripple effect, and that's how you have social change. You have, the shame that comes with wearing blood diamonds didn't just come out of nowhere. It was built over time incrementally until socially we all agreed, yeah, this is really problematic.
But one of the things as a consumer that I think about rhetorically is that technology almost becomes like fashion, where it's cool for a period of time, then it's not. I mean, I know I've had students that they're like, you still have an iPhone? I have an iPhone SE. I'm a big SE fan because they're cheap and they just do the job.
Right.
And they're like, what? That's like outdated. And I think, but it's a phone. It has just a purpose. It doesn't need to be, I have a Honda Accord, a 2000 Honda Accord, and it will probably be around longer than any of us. It will last forever. And in some ways, there's just this idea that why are you still using that? Why are you still in that strong pull of it's not cool to have something old? That is a really strong pull that I see with our students, and I even see with peers. And to add to that, what's frustrating when you're talking about a technological and with instructors is that I've had technology where someone from IT will come in and say, oh, well, that won't update anymore. That won't work anymore with what we're doing. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I don't grasp the reason why that is, but why is it that you've built something that will not be compatible with future updates? And is that part of planned obsolescence where they know, oh, well, in 5 years, this machine won't work with this program, and we kind of know that. So they're going to have to buy the program again and another piece of hardware.
Yeah, the device. The device is the problem. And for those of you listening at home who've never met Jim, just know there's consensus among everyone on campus that he is the coolest faculty around. And so don't let the news about the Honda and the SE trick you into thinking he's not super cool.
He's going to be the trendsetter. He's going to be the one to make iFixit and saving your technology as long as possible cool.
I've researched whether I can register my Honda Accord in the classic car. Unfortunately, I don't think I can, but it is 2000. Like I was kind of joke. My car can drink. It's 23 years old.
That's funny.
So my car is old enough to start collecting Social Security at some point, but in car years. But yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you've brought this issue and how you've brought this wonderful work being done by iFixit into your classrooms?
Do you want to start off, Lacy? Lacy actually introduced me to iFixit. She has longer experience with the organization than I do.
Yeah, so I will say like Joy mentioned, I've been working with iFixit since I was a graduate student. And I myself have done the standard project for summer courses. I did the Fast Fix project as well. And it really was because I believe in their mission of fighting planned obsolescence, reducing e-waste through empowering everyday individuals to make these fixes that will prolong the life of their devices. But also I see it as a really great opportunity for students to gain experience working with people outside of the classroom. I need not to downplay what we do as instructors, the feedback we provide, certainly not. But at the end of the day, they are going to have to respond to a client. They are going to have to respond to a boss. And I think that creates a different set of demands. And so the better that we can prepare them for that as they get out after graduation into their careers, I think the better off that they're going to be. Now, this past fall, so the fall of 2022, I taught Writing for Online Markets, which is an upper division tech writing course. And the way that I kind of wanted to re-envision it was basically saying, the internet is vast. There's a lot of stuff going on the internet. And in order for your content and the things that you're doing in these digital spaces to break through, you have to write in a certain way. You have to include certain type of media. You have to be not just rhetorically aware of what the audience wants, but of course what the algorithms want. And so that was what I really, especially during part of the course, wanted to focus on is how can students respond to the technology that's evaluating and thus prioritizing or not prioritizing their work when someone conducts a search on Google or DuckDuckGo or Bing, whatever search engine they happen to be using. And so I thought that the SEO project through iFixit would be a great, would serve a really good function in that course because one, it fit within what we were doing. Two, since these were all, or not all, but most of them were upper division technical writing students who are getting ready to graduate, giving them more professional experience, but also working with a company that I myself as an instructor could get behind, whose mission I could support, whose mission I firmly believed in. And so, as I mentioned in the presentation, I would say that throughout the project, there were a lot of challenges, especially because students were not working with familiar devices. And in fact, with the SEO project, so as I'm sure Joy will discuss, students with the standard project were working hands-on. With the SEO project, that wasn't the case. So rather, iFixit basically sent a sheet, a Google sheet of device pages that were really sparse, didn't have a ton of content that really needed to be revamped, and said, okay, pick one. And so many of them were medical devices. Things like defibrillators and scanning software, scanning machines, and others there was a lot of hardware tools on there as well. And so this was very much outside of the students' wheelhouse, and they would regularly admit that. And I think the research process took us the longest because they're like, we have no idea how a defibrillator works. We've only seen it in movies. I'm like, same here. Well, good luck with the research. Let's see what we can do. But again, it all circles back to how can we prolong the use of these otherwise good devices? And I will say expensive devices as well, especially when you get into that medical equipment. But of course, anyone going to Lowe's or Home Depot knows that sometimes those hardware tools and technologies can run up a pretty decent bill as well. And so students were asked, to think, okay, well, how can we craft our writing? How can we become so familiar with the ins and outs of these conversations and of these devices to basically utilize keywords properly, to include the proper links, so that way when the web crawlers are going through our content, they say this is quality, this matches the search query that some internet user plugged in to the search box. And so we're going to put it toward the top rather than hiding it on the, hiding it on page 2, because who goes to page 2 on Google? But using iFixit again is just something that I think, again, gave students really great professional experience, also with a good purpose behind it, with that they could say, not only did we get something out of it individually that we can put on our resume, that we can speak to in interviews, but we also are now a part of this fight of contributing to e-waste. We are now empowering other individuals to make these fixes, and they are going to be able to more easily locate this content, these repair guides, because of the revisions that we made to the existing pages and the content, the additional content that we created for that as well.
There, in a previous session, I believe it was Monday, there was a talk where someone was saying, they sounded like they were from a STEM background, and they were saying, sometimes humanities people, they want to be heard, but then we ask them to get invested in technology. They're like, well, that's not my thing. And this sounds like there's an investment in humanities of wanting to know the inner workings, which kind of goes in the face. And I think that idea needs to be promoted, because we want, as humanities people, to say, yeah, we want to know how the technology works. We don't want to just say, pay attention to us and read the things that we read, but when you ask me to code, I don't want to code. That we want to demystify the technology. Another thing I was thinking about when you were talking is that, speaking of demystifying, is there a vested interest in sort of making that technology locked away to the public, and that what you're doing and what you're talking about actually helps sort of bring the technology to the public? Because I think about earlier on when you were saying how Apple's pretty notorious for, if you open up the Apple computer, warranty's void, we can't help you. And versus PCs, which are kind of like, yeah, just buy your hard drives online and open up your computer and do whatever you want with it. I always kind of wondered in this idea of, well, we have everything. You don't look behind the curtain. You just give us your money. And so do you think there's sort of a revolutionary aspect in what you're teaching students to say everybody wants access to what's going on inside of the technology?
I think so. And what's especially interesting, because as I keep up with iFixit and what they're doing, I know that on sort of the more civically engaged side, they're working with lawmakers at state levels and at the federal level as well for right to repair to work its way into law. So therefore preventing companies from sort of having this curtain up. And I will say that some companies are actually taking initiative in response to that. I believe it's Google recently partnered with iFixit for some of their new phones to basically say, okay, well, how can we, do these repair guides? How can we make, how can we make the repair guides more accessible? How can we make them more user-friendly? And so there are larger tech companies that are certainly taking to this. And I think, the work with students, maybe that's not the main cause behind it, but I think it certainly helps, because students who are also voters, who are also publicly engaged, are now becoming interested in these topics. And they're saying, okay, well, what if, with all of these devices, again, especially the pricier ones, that we've sunk a lot of money into, or that can have the most negative impact through environmental damage, how can we make it to where these companies are more open about the repair process?
So one of the ethical principles I turn to most as a technical writer is the idea of informed choice. And I think right to repair aligns with that ethical approach the idea of giving people choice, and right to repair is not obligation to repair, right? You still have the right to purchase the newest, you still have the right to get your prestige through purchases, right? But if you choose not to, you then have the ability. Right now, so much tech is prohibitive, cost prohibitive, knowledge prohibitive, expertise, mechanical. There's all kinds of guardrails against repair. And so that's iFixit. We didn't emphasize that at all in our presentation. So I'm glad Lacy mentioned that now. iFixit as an organization is working with policymakers, is trying to change legislation that improves the right to repair. And not even just through policy, but through volunteer cooperation from corporations.
Joy, I know you have to leave us and go teach. Why don't we do this? Could we get a informal promise from you to come back and talk to us later? Because your work in your English 2010 class with the iFixit standard project and what you had those students do, and the work that they were able to produce was really astounding. And I wasn't alone in my admiration. The provost spoke to me afterwards and talked about how impressed he was about what's going on in your classroom. So can we get a commitment from you to come back and talk about that in detail on a future program?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I do want to make a quick correction. It is English 2100. I don't want anybody to hear this and think I'm doing this in 2010. It's the technical writing class. So we have software engineers, mechanical engineers, graphic designers, and technical writers. Before I leave, I want to say one thing about Lacy said that one of her students said, I don't know anything about defibrillators. This isn't what I expected from an English class. I had a similar experience with one of my students who was having real trouble with the Dyson blow dryer. It's like a $450 blow dryer that is impossible to get into. I mean, it was really a frustrating product. And he rightly was pretty frustrated. I took it home more than once to try to dig into it myself. But what he said to me was, I didn't sign up for technical writing class to learn to be a small appliance mechanic. I want to write. And I said, what are you going to write about? And he said, I'm an English major for a reason. I said, well, writers don't just write about writing. I mean, you're limiting the scope of the work you can do and what you can contribute to society if you just write about writing. I said, technical writers, and this is the takeaway for me, technical writers are mediators between experts and novices. We're the mediator between the product and the person. And that's the work that we do in the class with this iFixit project. We mediate between products and people to improve the lives of people. And that's the humanistic approach. It's not just that we're intrigued by or interested in or want to know more about technology. We want to know more about what we can do to improve a world governed by technology for people. So that would be my takeaway. But anyway, I'd be happy to come back and talk to you both. Anyway, I'm going to run teach. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I did have one follow-up question for you, Lacy. So tell me a little bit about what are the techniques and approaches that you give us, just some of the basic guidelines that you give to your students about this idea of SEO writing, the kind of writing. I know there are other factors that are going to push your website or your wiki or your blog or whatever it is higher up a search engine. What are the writing techniques that students, or anybody, not just students, anybody can use to kind of optimize the search engines?
Again, a very good question. So when it comes to text-based alphabetic writing, I think simplicity, conciseness, which is a key component in effective technical writing. How can we make the content more accessible and more engaging to understand? But also using keywords effectively. I think that perhaps is something we came back to quite frequently. And I had mentioned this to the provost that while we were completing this project, we also had a guest lecturer from up at Zonos come in and speak with the class. And this individual was basically their SEO guru. And that was another thing that he stressed as well. And it's not just so much about using keywords, but using them properly in the correct context.
Yeah. I actually thought about that earlier on in this interview when I used the phrase intentional obsolescence, and then you both said planned obsolescence. So if I were to write intentional obsolescence, that was probably going to have a very different effect than if I write planned obsolescence, which sounds to me like the more commonly used term.
Exactly. And that's when, and I'm sure that you all have discussed this with 1010 and 2010 students when you're teaching them how to find articles on the library database, tinkering around with those keywords. If at first you don't find what you're looking for, okay, well, what synonyms can you put into place? Now, SEO writing, we are challenged with saying, okay, well, what is the right, what's the right word? Like, we don't have the ability to tinker around with synonyms all that much. So going back to your example, if the accepted phrase is planned obsolescence, then we need to be aware of that. And then we need to use that again in the correct context. Right. And so as the writers, we want to be aware of, okay, well, what is this discussion, this conversation going on about this topic? What are the words that people are using to describe it? And how are they using that? And so by using the most commonly accepted keywords or key phrases with a particular topic in the appropriate context is going to help basically the web crawlers say, okay, well, this is quality material. This reflects the search query that a user posed. And so that way we can say, okay, well, if you're looking for a good place to get a cookie dough shake in St. George, Utah, if I use cookie dough shake in St. George, Utah in an article that I'm writing or in a blog post that I'm writing, then it is more likely, of course, to get boosted than if I use cookie dough and shake and St. George in separate places within an article, within the same, within the same post. And so it's just being aware of how keywords are used and how to incorporate that effectively into whatever it is you're writing. And of course, that's challenging. Yeah. But can definitely be beneficial overall.
Right. And I think the implications are important because, like we've been talking about here in this interview, sure, those of us who produce any kind of web content, it can be financially lucrative to appear higher in a search. But as you talked about in your presentation, these repair guides that you're having your students produce, you want people to be able to find them. You want people to be able to access them. You want people to have that ability to go online, find a step-by-step process that may help them fix something that is essential to them. And if that content is buried, deep in an online search, then it's not going to get out to as many people as you want it to.
Absolutely. And I think it's especially critical for companies like iFixit that do not hide their content behind a paywall. Of course, there have been times where I have, said, okay, well, I'm looking to, get instructions on how to repair a joystick for, my gaming console, right? And there will be times where you click on it and says, oh, you need to subscribe. You need to buy a membership or do something along those lines. So of course, those search results are, because again, they're using keywords effectively, their site architecture, their reputation, all of that, meets the criteria for being prioritized higher on the search results. But at the end of the day, what good does that do me if I'm in a position where I'm like, oh, I really don't want to spend, $6 a month on a subscription just because I need this one repair guide, or I need instructions on how to make this one fix. And so especially with companies like iFixit using Creative Commons, promoting something that is open access, I think, becomes all the more important for quality SEO writing.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, I was so impressed. And, those moments when you just have something that you know a little bit about, or you've heard a little bit about, and you have somebody present it to you, and not only present it in an effective way, but present it in a way that makes you see this is something really important that we need to be thinking about and talking about. That's kind of the experience that I had in the presentation this morning. So really, I'm still working on processing everything that I've been presented with in the last 90 minutes or so.
Well, thank you. They were definitely, the students were great. iFixit was great. And like I said, it's a mission that I think anyone can get behind, especially after they realize the weight of the problem, the severity of the problem. Students want to be a part of it. Now, that's one thing that I really do appreciate about the students here at Utah Tech, is that if you say this, hey, there's this issue going on, here's a project where we can help be a part of the solution in some way, shape, or form, 9 times out of 10, they're like, okay, we're in. This seems like something worth, addressing. And if we can do that within the confines of the course, that's awesome. We're here for it. And like I said, even though there were certainly some challenges, my students kept a very positive, optimistic attitude because of what their work was going to contribute and what was going to come of all of the research and all of the writing and all of the revisions that they ultimately did to have their pages published.
Which is a wonderful way to move students away from sort of the leveling and the credentialing that happens in education to actually then turn the focus to how do I impact the world, which is really, I think, what brings us probably to work every day, is not just, all right, well, I'm just going to move a student from a upper division or a lower division to an upper division course. No, I want a student to go from my class to making environmental changes to our world, or changes to our world that will positively impact our environment. I mean, that's the exciting part. It's not the fact that they're necessarily getting awards and medals along the way just for their paycheck. I want them to make an impact in this world, and that sounds like your project is directing them towards their passion, or that type of passion.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to hear more about what Joy has to say about this, because I know all of the students in my course were English majors. And so, but as she had mentioned earlier on, many of the students that she was working with were engineering students. So I'm even more excited to hear about her experiences with that, with students that we don't interact with, that come from different disciplines, different academic backgrounds, and perhaps how that mentality can translate into other professional and academic sectors.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, congratulations on a very successful presentation, and continued success in your work with projects like this. So this has been another of our on-the-spot interviews from the 2013 Global Polytechnic Summit here at Utah Tech University. We're back again at the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit. And we've got 3 guests right now who are from the University of Wisconsin Stout. Joining us are Professors Mitch Ogden and Jennifer Astwood, and research graduate student Olivia DeCasta, who's a graduate student in industrial design.
Oh, undergraduate student in industrial design.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry about that. Undergraduate student in industrial design. Perfect. Let's start off our conversation by talking about the way that you've been able to incorporate humanities fabrication into a collaboration with people in the, let's extend STEM and say STEAM disciplines.
Well, Mitch, I'm going to have you start us off.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So we'll take from STEM to STEAM, and then, if you will, we'll take it to STEAM. And so if we put that H for humanities in there, really have a much more expansive and inclusive and really kind of provocative and interesting configuration of disciplines together. And so humanities fabrication is one way. I think there's a lot of promise and possibility for the humanities to have a place in this space where they have often kind of been left out or on the fringe at best. So being able to actually physically create objects and artifacts that have historical importance, that speak to cultural movements, that may be tied into particular social groups. That's the spirit of humanities fabrication. And I think Gentry Sayers should be named as a scholar at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, as one who's been, I think, a really meaningful developer of the ideas of this through his Kits for Cultural History. And so it becomes a way to kind of draw in museum studies, to draw in archives, to draw in material histories, right into a Fab Lab space, right into space of engineers and designers, artists and creators and makers, and really pull in then big questions about history, about culture, and about the things that matter to us as humans, right? Which is what drives the humanities.
Excellent. I think those ideas are great, and I like adding to the acronym, make it longer. I agree with that completely. Let's talk about the specific project that you presented on, the redesign of the spaghetti spinner. Tell us about this.
Mitch, I think you can provide a little bit of background and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so the story of it is once I met Gentry Sayers and saw what they were doing in their lab in Canada with this humanities fabrication, I really got excited. I wanted to do something as well. And I, to try to constrain it and help give some focus, I thought, well, let's, as a public university in the state of Wisconsin, let's pick an artifact that is attached to our state. So I had a research assistant who looked at kind of every invention or innovation attributed to Wisconsinites. And it's a long list, right? From Harley-Davidson motorcycles to the Sunbeam stand mixer. Wisconsin's produced a lot of interesting and good things, but none of them really kind of fit the bill until she found this character, and I mean that quite intentionally, Russell Oakes, who gave himself the name Professor I Am Nuts. And Russell Oakes was an ad man. That's what his day job was, but he's also a garage tinkerer. And so he would make these clever, absurd contraptions, gadgets of convenience in his garage. And then he had a whole show, a traveling show that he would take to business meetings where he would show off these wacky things. And in fact, he even funded trips to Hollywood where he would shoot newsreels at Paramount Studios. So he would get some sort of coverage at the movie theaters where people would see their newsreel before the feature film when they went to the movies on Saturday. So one of his many, many gadgets that are held in the Waukesha County History Museum in Waukesha, Wisconsin, was this spaghetti spinner. It's really just an egg beater with the kind of whisk removed and a fork put in its place. so you can wind up your spaghetti more easily with the power of a gear and a handle and the spin. So that's just, for me, is just the kind of like absurd, ridiculous, wacky item that raises a lot of interesting questions and makes something kind of fun for students to explore. So I think Jen and Olivia now have dug in deep on this particular contraption. I think we'll have a lot to say on how they approach it as well.
So Mitch approached me about a year ago asking if there would be a possibility for a collaboration. And it just so happened with their schedule, we were able to work this past spring. So I called in Olivia and we did an independent study. Mitch had, prior to this point, gone into a fifth grade classroom and had another group of students work on this spaghetti spinner. And there's some challenges with it. I think it took 75 minutes for it to be constructed in class. Is that correct, Mitch?
Yeah.
And so we were working on the design, detailing, fabrication. So our goal was, Mitch was our client, and we were working on making the contraption more fun, more whimsical, but also easier to put together, so that the focus for when he went to the fifth grade classroom and talked to him about the process or about the historical aspects of this, that they're focused on that versus like the pain and torture of putting the contraption together. So there were a lot of things that we tweaked in the process, and Olivia focused on the design full-heartedly. Want to talk about that?
So basically, once I had received the initial 1.0 spinner from Mitch, it had been more engineered than designed. So I got to basically go all in with the design aspect of it. And I also wanted to kind of incorporate, this is a historical object, but what would it look like now with the capabilities of Fab Lab and the things we have today? They didn't have laser cutting, they didn't have 3D printing back then. So I really kind of wanted to push the design as far as possible and fully utilize the capabilities of the Fab Lab and the 3D printing. And throughout that process, we were able to get the time down to about 20 minutes, which is just awesome, because then Mitch was able to go in and explain more of the concepts of humanities and that sort of thing and how it's applicable. And they're not just getting frustrated trying to put something together.
Weren't spending all their time in the assembly process.
Yes.
Some assembly required, right?
Well, it sounds like your project it's creating a lot of avenues to communicate with different stakeholders, which is an important part. I know that every student needs to realize that they're not going to work in a vacuum, that you're going to work with clients, you're going to work in group. I mean, every time I say this is a group project, a student will groan and go, oh, I thought I was just able to do all my work alone and not have to work with other people. So were there any hiccups in the sort of communication and stakeholder process that are intentional hiccups? Mitch being the client, were there times when you were just being difficult?
Yeah, Mitch, were you being difficult at all?
I'm such an easygoing guy. I think the reality is this is the both the real affordance of collaboration, but also the pain. There were, and I think I feel comfortable saying this given the strength of the collaboration that we had. Like, there were definitely design decisions that I was like, wait a minute. So version 1.0, you have to understand, and your listeners can't see the thing, but it was very literal. So I'd hired an industrial design student to make that first version, and as Olivia characterized it, it was very engineered and it was very literal. And that was the instruction I gave her: make this look as much as possible like this original artifact that's sitting in the museum. And so he was constrained by that kind of directive. And there was a part of me that was really attached. Like, this is like a literal kind of recreation. It was made of plastic and wood and not the same. It wouldn't fool you, right, as a replica by any stretch. And that was never the point. But it had the dimensions and it had the look and feel of the thing. But that was what led us to this painful build process. It was just overwrought. So there were definitely times as the collaborator, I was like, but you changed it. It looks different now. And I think Jennifer and Olivia, they could see it in my eyes. I'm like, well, but that doesn't look. But that is ultimately what moved the project ahead to really accomplish some of these bigger goals, as Olivia said, where there was actually time to talk about the bigger questions instead of just being like stuck. I mean, I'm running around with a rivet gun in a 5th grade classroom, like attaching. Yeah, it was. I wouldn't say a hot mess, but the mess was pretty warm.
You mentioned talking about other things once the assembly takes place. What are the things that you talk about with these 5th graders, and what are the other things you talk about with students in connection with this collaborative project?
I think part of the unintended consequence was just asking them questions about, if you could develop a machine to do anything to make your life easier, what would you do? I remember hearing Mitch say that in the class, and it was really interesting to hear what the 5th grade students thought about it. And you can see right away, even in a 5th grade classroom, how there's like a fear to come up with an idea, because some students were very quiet, but then some students spoke right up, and it was really fun to see their excitement. Was that different than the first time that you presented to the class, Mitch?
Yeah, I mean, truth be told, like I couldn't fit that question in, like quite literally. The initial visit, so a year ago, it was, hey, here's this guy, his name's Russell Oakes, here's this fork, we're gonna make it. Don't ask any questions. Like, we don't have time. Grab your partner and like lay the bolts out, like in ascending order. Like, it was too complex, and so we missed those opportunities to ask those questions. And those questions are the only ones that really matter. If I can zoom out just a little bit to where this project really, really began, my son was a 5th grader in this in his 5th grade classroom, and I was super impressed. It was this teacher's first year in our district, in our school, and he had several 3D printers, and I thought, man, that's so unusual to have 3D printers in a 5th grade classroom. I'm so excited to see what they do with these. And I remember one day my son came home from class, and he had this 3D printed frog, a little small frog, maybe the size of like a $50. And I said, well, that's cool. Did you guys talk about frog life cycle or frogs in the ecosystem? And he's like, no, I just found a frog, printed it, and thought it would be cool. And I was like, so here it is, this great technology, but like really not serving a real purpose. And that's where I'm like, if we do use these technologies, they're almost always for an entrepreneurial business endeavor, or to solve an engineering problem. And that's where I said they should also be able to support, humanities. Well, for that matter, like biological sciences, right? Like, why not, talk about frogs and then print a frog, but talk about the frogs first. And so again, what Olivia and Jennifer really did is help really get me to the purpose of this project, which was not to build a fork. The purpose of the project was really to have this conversation about, why do we like machines so much? Why do we expect them to do our jobs for us? Is there any problem with that? Do we have an over-reliance on tools and gadgets? Do we have an over-reliance on our digital apps to do everything for us? And so the collaboration really allowed us to actually accomplish that purpose of the project from the very beginning.
Yeah, and those are very important questions to be asking. How many times in the last several months have those questions come up surrounding ChatGPT, right? I mean, those are the very questions we're finding ourselves having to ask. Excellent. I'd like to just ask you, what kind of support did you get from your institution for this kind of cross-disciplinary project? And is this something that you think could continue? This kind of project could be lead to other interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary projects at your institution?
Well, in terms of support, the institution supported us to have an independent study with Olivia. So she was able to do it in her curriculum. So that was really helpful to do that. In terms of financial support, I would say the university also supplied materials for fabrication, for laser cutting, and also for digital printing, 3D printing.
We also have our Fab Lab space, which I'm sure these are configured differently on different campuses, but our Fab Lab is open to all students, all faculty, really all members, right, of the campus community to use. And so, 2 laser cutters, a CNC router, several 3D printers, and I think importantly the expertise and the support of the director and the lab technicians who support students. And so having that kind of space where outside of a lab that's used for classroom purposes, it's really that's a pretty valuable asset that I've always been grateful for, to have a fully outfitted Fab Lab that even I, as an English professor, am allowed to go use. I think that's a pretty profound piece of support from our institution, and it's been established for many years on our campus.
And also in our industrial design area, we have a bunch of 3D printers that we were able to purchase because of sponsored projects and being able to support our students. So this process of this project required a lot of 3D printing and a lot of testing and tweaking of the design to get it to that 20-minute time slot of making sure that the students could put it together in that time period. And also to take out some other parts and some other hardware that was not necessary.
I know in humanities, I'm guilty enough of they're not giving any funding or resources to the humanities. They're diverting all this money to STEM. And it's amazing how often if you just ask or you have a good project idea, they're like, oh yeah, definitely. Here's the funding, here's the support. And it's encouraging to see projects like this where you see, it's not that they're going to strip down funding here and throw it there. It's people have good ideas and they're putting money towards good ideas and resources towards. So this is great.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Olivia, how did you find this project an enhancement to your overall education experience at the university?
Well, I really liked being able to work with faculty like Mitch and Jen. They were just absolutely, I couldn't ask for better people to work with. And I also really liked the sort of independence of this project. Like, it wasn't like a class where I had to go in every week at a set time. Usually almost every bi-weekly, Jen and I and Mitch would check up and sort of assess what was working and what wasn't and what needed to be done, that sort of thing. So I really kind of liked that. And I felt like that would be very applicable working with clients in the real world. It'd be that sort of thing. You have to hold yourself accountable. There's no one going to be holding your hand necessarily when you get into the workforce, that sort of thing. And also it was a lot of just sort of like cross-disciplinary, talking to different people in different departments. When can I get into the lab? How does this work? Training on the lab, that sort of thing that I really enjoyed to sort of get me to the next step. And also being here, I felt like was a very awesome opportunity to sort of network and that sort of thing, and also kind of hone my skills talking to other people, presenting, that sort of thing. And I also really enjoyed the whole process of trial and error and what's going to work, what's not going to work, what sort of you can expect coming to work every day. Oh, this didn't work, so I have to do this now. And I also have to do this. Like just multitasking, that sort of thing, as well as creating just opportunities and networking, that sort of thing.
Excellent. I was interested in talking to you all for the project, but also because you probably know we're very new in the Polytechnic arena as an institution, and in the exploratory phase when we were examining what kind of institution we were going to create, we did collaborate with your institution. I think we're similar in many ways. We at Utah Tech, not only are we a Polytechnic, but we're an open admissions institution. And that really poses some challenges for us, but also creates a good deal of potential. You are Wisconsin's Polytechnic University, and I'm guessing from what I've heard that you aren't like a typical Polytechnic in the sense that you have very, very rigorous academic entry requirements. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So what kinds of challenges and opportunities do you see working with the kinds of students that you get in a Polytechnic environment? I know that's a kind of a broad question, but what have some of your experiences been?
Well, I'll start on this one. I'm going to talk about the opportunities before I start about the challenges. Some of the opportunities is that we get first-generation college students, and we also get students who are at a lower economic status in terms of what they come in with. I personally have always believed in terms of my class structure, my teaching process, that I'm bringing everyone up. I'm not just bringing people who have had these opportunities in high school or elementary school because they went to this amazing school. I think our university is wonderful in terms of that. We teach all the school skills for the most part that they'll need to be an entry-level industrial designer, at least in our area. And I think that's a huge thing because the playing field will never be fair, most likely, right? But we can do our part to bring everyone up, and I think that's a huge thing. So to me, that's the biggest opportunity in exposing students what's possible. Mitch, would you like to?
Yes. I think what you will likely see is Utah Tech, grows and continues to sort of deploy its new model, a Polytechnic model. What I see at Stout is the range of sort of engagement with with projects like this. That require a certain level of imagination, a certain level of sort of comfort, delving into the unexplored or the unknown or uncomfortable. There's a lot of range I find in the performance of students, and when we give them these Polytechnic projects, something like the spaghetti spinner that's part of class. So you see some really high performance and some. And maybe some kind of lower performance in what they create in the deliverable. But I think to reinforce what Jennifer is saying, some of that high performance comes from the students that haven't succeeded academically in the past in more traditional institutions. I think there are many who thrive where the problem solving is really, really immediate and hands-on. Where it's less about maybe your ability to digest, a 15-page complex theoretical article, and more about really taking a look at a practical situation, understanding the context, and then doing what Olivia was talking about, that iterative design process, that learning through mistakes. And I think so many students find that Polytechnic model really invigorating, really refreshing. And for a whole population of students who just sat in a chair and listened for so many hours of their life, it's pretty empowering to watch them walk and pace and move and work in a pod and collaborate and build and iterate and prototype. It's the best kind of work to do, and it makes working at a place like UW Stout, and I hope at a place like Utah Tech, a very, very gratifying career.
You're certainly echoing, both of you are echoing a lot of the things that I hold important in terms of what I hope to deliver to my students and the opportunities that I hope that we give them. And it sounds like we do have very similar student bodies, and the potential is definitely there for us to follow the model that you all are setting. It's really pretty impressive, and I really thank you all for joining us, spending a little time talking to us about your project. Good luck with your future collaborations, and we will see you later. This is our final installment from the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Really interesting words from a lot of people who are doing a lot of really unique things and really thought-provoking things in the fields of humanities and technology.
Yeah, it was really exciting. It was great to hear this.
Great experience at the 2023 Global Polytechnic Summit at Utah Tech University. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast.